Perfect. Now we welcome Matthias Stürmer. The second time, I guess the last presentation you had during the Corona time where we did the full remote open source event. Happy to have you now again here on stage live in Zug. Thank you, Matthias.
Thank you, Roger. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here physically because I heard there will be a nice barbecue afterwards. So that's the main reason why I joined. So hello, and I'm very happy to talk first about this new open source law in Switzerland. So question to you, does anybody know, has heard from the embark? Embark? Very few, but one or two hands, very good. My colleague from former town where we lived, from Aspeby, he knows it, that's very good. So my name is Matthias Stürmer, I'm researcher, so you don't have to read that. Only one thing is important, I'm here also as a president from CH Open, Open Source Association from Switzerland. So if you're interested in some non-profit organization supporting open source since over 40 years, please join our association. So thanks also to Siemens and other companies who are members for many years now. At the Bern University of Applied Science, we are a team of 60 people. And why I'm showing this? Because of the lady on the upper right corner. This is Rika Koch. She is our lawyer, our professor in the team, and she actually prepared this presentation with me, and we showed an earlier version at the FOSDEM in February in Brussels, and that's why Roger asked to also show it here. So we do lots of areas of research about public procurement, data management, smart government, IT, sustainability, and AI. And the one main topic, of course, is open source software, because that's also where I'm coming from. I'm very bad in programming, so don't expect any code from me, but I love open source since more than 20 years and I organized events, the first open source events more than 20 years ago. So, maybe one last announcement. I'm currently preparing this open source study. Every 3 years we make a survey with companies and government agencies in Switzerland, and to ask how much open source do you use, why do you use it, why don't you use it yet, and so on. And we'll present the results in June in Zurich, and so please join us. There will be many interesting talks even from Microsoft and the Aspeby this year, so we have very interesting sponsors of the study. Now, so the Swiss embark, the law I would like to talk is, first I would like to explain to you a little bit the history on actually the current state of open source in Switzerland, then the history, and finally the content, what is actually mandatory, are the exceptions of this new law. And if we have time, I'm very happy to discuss with you. So obviously everybody of us knows open source in companies releasing open source and actually contributing to open source. This is mainstream nowadays. However, in government, it's not like that, as you also might have heard. Nevertheless, there was in Bern, actually 6 years ago, an article which was saying eigennützige Softwaregeschenke. So why should governments give away software for free? Because they actually benefit from it. It's not like a gift when you are invited for a birthday party and you give something to a friend and you don't expect, or you should expect something back. In open source, it's very normal to expect something back. If you contribute, you don't do it just for saving the world, but actually you do it for benefit. And this is normal, but for government actually it's not so normal yet. There are exceptions. There are exceptions like Swiss Topo, the Swiss Karten Landestopography. So this actually agency, they actually fund open source since many years. They have everything on the open source stack, and they actually did crowdfunding for open layers a couple of years ago, where they collected several hundred thousands of Swiss francs with other national agencies for maps. And so that's how they actually improved this open layers library, which when you go to the map Geoportal Switzerland, then you actually use everything is open source. And there are also, within procurement, there are good practices starting slowly but steadily to where actually where governments ask providers to really offer open source software. Here, for example, it's not below the new law, but it's actually about procuring open source software. It's actually buying open source with very specific criteria, such as the software has to be provided below an open source license. It has to use a copyleft license, not just any license. The company has to have experience in open sourcing software, and it also has to provide community management. So there's obviously a business case for companies selling open source. However, that's not the law at the moment yet. So nowadays, the city of Bern, they actually do it voluntarily in a way because they know how they will benefit in the long term. And there are, of course, some success stories. You might have heard of the Swiss COVID certificate, where the BIT, the federal IT department, they actually released the code, and the Austrian people actually used the code and integrated the Swiss COVID app into the Austrian system, and actually more or less removed the logo and changed the logo. Or the other success story is Columa and Inoska, a story where the company Adfinis actually released open source software, an open source workflow framework, Columa, and they actually organized the community of several cantons using this for lots of workflows within the government. And finally, as on the board said just before, there's this Open Rail Association where the SPB is one of the main drivers behind this association. So there's open source going on. You might have heard of ossbenchmark.com, a little website which we created at our institute to actually monitor the roughly 220 Swiss government and Swiss companies releasing open source on GitHub. So you can do some benchmarking and see how much open source is being released by which company. In case your company is not on there yet, please let us know, because it's managed mainly manually, where we add the repositories and the crawler crawls. And it's about 13,000, like about 10,000 repositories, and plus the forks, about 13,000 Swiss open source repositories, if you want to say. And there is obviously some of the Swiss federal agencies, Swiss Topo, as I mentioned, Meteo Schweiz, Meteo Suisse, and the BIT and others. They actually also release open source. So here are the numbers of 74 repositories by the Swiss Topo and so on. So there's some significant open sourcing going on. However, there was no legal basis in the past. Nevertheless, it makes sense, because you might have heard of the whole discussion about data colonialism and digital sovereignty. So there is a national interest in actually having more independence from American or other foreign companies. So we wrote several reports about this topic. One was on the left side, and one is actually now in the process of being finished, about the strategy of digital sovereignty in Switzerland. It's not about open source only, but open source will play an important role in this new strategy, which is actually coming out in the end of this year. Now, this law, which we have heard, everybody, of course, of this public money, public code campaign. The Free Software Foundation Europe, they launched this campaign a couple of years ago, and was very successful, as Max Mehl, who will speak after me, will also remember. So this was quite a success, and on the European level, it's very common to share and reuse software. So there's lots of things going on in other countries about that, and there was also never a discussion if the government should or should not, or is allowed to release open source or not. I remember a couple of years ago in Brussels, when I explained our problems in Switzerland, they really didn't understand why there is a problem in releasing open source from the public sector. But I'll show you in a minute why this was a problem. So in Switzerland, there was really nothing in the past. There was no legal foundation, and if there's no, if there's no law in government, people say usually, well, I have to have a legal foundation, otherwise I'm not allowed to do anything. And this is the best excuse, so to do nothing except for some enthusiasts in Swiss Topo and Metro Schweiz, which were, I think, pretty much below the radar of any IT management person. Which is good, because this actually shows the power of developers. This shows how we can advance even without management. We can proceed and go on. Nevertheless, at a certain level, you cannot proceed. So this is why we start this whole process. So the question actually started with this question: can the public sector, any government agency, develop and distribute open source? And for us, for the IT people, of course, why not? However, for the lawyers, for the judges, they really don't understand. And if they don't understand it, they don't like it. And so it's really the main problem was about this thing. And so why it started everything? Actually, it started quite positively, because in 2011, we had one member of the parliament, he actually asked how can release of open source software be promoted by the government. So there actually was some initial political will, because there was also the Swiss Federal Court. The Swiss Federal Court over 10 years ago wanted to publish open source, their Open Justitia court management system, and the canton of Bern and other cantons wanted to reuse it. So it was perfectly fine actually to start this movement. However, there was a little Bernese company, Weblaw. Maybe some of you might know them. They're very famous within the IT lawyers, and they're very good in actually researching and publishing about IT things in the legal side. However, they also provided software solutions for the courts. So they thought now the Swiss Federal Court actually is in competition to their business. And that's why actually they asked an old guy, Tony Brunner, you might remember this guy, to really ask the opposite thing. So why actually does the Federal Court destroy business of a local IT company with open source software? So this was the beginning of our 10 years fighting. So that's why Tony Brunner, I don't like him. Now, what does the government? They actually said, well, we are neutral, like the Swiss people often say. So therefore, we actually want some professors to tell us what is good and what is bad. So the Swiss government actually issued a study, a Gutachten for two non-IT persons. And they asked them, well, is it allowed that the government distributes software for free if, especially the highest court in Switzerland, which controls everything? Obviously not. So therefore, the free distribution of public software is an economic act that leads to market distortion. So therefore, actually, the lawyers came to the conclusion, well, it destroys the business, and therefore, actually, it's bad competition because taxpayers actually destroy the economy. So there was no legal basis, and there was nothing necessary they have to do. The Federal Court, obviously, they were not forced. They actually just wanted the IT head of IT. They just were a fan of open source. They used a lot of open source. By the way, they never introduced Microsoft. Every court decision, 7,000 court decisions per year are from the Federal Court are written on LibreOffice, and so they're highly open source minded for since 20 years. And so that's why actually they also wanted to release open source. Now, therefore, they actually got a really big hit on their activities, and so they were prohibited to actually further release Open Justitia, which was very sad because they received awards and everything. Now, the next step, well, what can you do if one lawyer says no? Well, we ask another lawyer. It's very simple in the world. We just looked at which lawyers are actually capable to understand open source and which will actually help our agenda. So we asked a second legal opinion. First, we have to fundraise because our budget is not as big as the one from the federal administration. They have about 60 billion Swiss francs per year. So ours is a little bit smaller from CH Open. So that's why we had a couple of years to fundraise. But then actually Simon Schlaueri, which you might have heard, he's a very good IT lawyer from Zurich, St. Gallen, and other lawyers, they actually released a new legal opinion, and this was actually the framing. So now open sourcing is not an economic act, but it's actually auxiliary service. So it's a Randnutzung. It just actually offers, like in a little town where there's a gym from the school. The gym is not used in the evening, so therefore the local associations can use the gym for their purpose for free or pay a little bit, but it's just infrastructure. And this is also important to understand nowadays. It's just digital public infrastructure. When government builds software or actually asks people to build software, then it's part of the digital public infrastructure. Now, this actually doesn't distort the market because there is actually no services around it. So the service would have been provided by companies. There are companies providing services for open source software, something very new. And then there's no need for a legal basis because the government does it nowadays already to provide things to the public without some law that actually asks them to open up the gym, for example. So that's why these lawyers came to the conclusion, yes, it's allowed, you can actually continue. And obviously, well, by the way, it was paid by the canton of Bern because there we knew that the people will support it, and they were able to pay the bills from the expensive lawyers, and also they were more credible if some open source association would have said, well, it's legally allowed. It's important that it was it came from a public administration, obviously. And so that was 2018, where the canton of Bern said, well, we love open source, we do an open source law even nowadays, and we publish open source, and it's voluntary in the canton of Bern, but it's allowed, and so this was enough for the moment. Nevertheless, on the federal level, there were no decision yet made if the Bund, if the federal administration is allowed to open source or not, because this is canton of Bern, it's completely different than the Bund, and so therefore, actually, we had to start over, and luckily there was a new law being issued, some e-government law called MBAG, and so the initial version of the MBAG actually had Article 10, where it says the administration is allowed to open source if certain conditions are good. So therefore, it was possible for the government to open up. So this was when I saw it for the first time, I was very happy and said, well, that's good. We don't have to do anything. However, or good enough, in Switzerland, we have this Vernehmlassung thing, this consulting process, where people, government agencies and so on can actually propose improvements to a law. And so there we said, Simon Schlauer and I, so let's make some suggestions how they can improve this law. And so we said, well, they don't just can open source, but they actually do open source. They stellen open source. Huh? And then they say, well, we improved some strange things which they wrote there. And this is very important, the default, obviously. They don't just do it if they want to, but they actually have to. And so this was the Maximalforderung, the major thing. But and then actually the second version of the law even was a little bit more accepting, that they actually accepted our recommendation in this Vernehmlassung process, which usually doesn't happen. Usually you write something and they ignore it. But in this case, they actually accepted. So they actually do open source if possible, and if it makes sense, and if the rights of third parties are respected. So if. Huh? So therefore, well, I thought, well, that's good. It's even better than before, but we could improve it even more. So we activated our group, the Parlamentary group. So it's a group of parliamentarians, which initially also, since 15 years now, promote open source software in Switzerland, the Swiss Parliament. These are the current members of this group. We do open source promotion and open data and open content and so on. So they're more than open source, but we start with open source, and this is also my main activity. And we are very thankful to the different companies who actually support this particular group, because that's why we can still do this nowadays after 15 years. So this group actually I'm leading, and so therefore I wrote to this commission, the members of the commission, which were about to discuss this new law. So please think about actually not just allowing federal government to open source software, but actually make it the default, make it the mandatory. So there was some explanation, some Begründung. So therefore, I hoped they would accept it. Nevertheless, it didn't work. So really, in the first moment, so this is the steps which one law takes, and this law was discussed. Well, first released from the Federal Council, the Bundesrat, where this was this exception, wenn es möglich und sinnvoll ist und die Rechte der Dritte gewahrt werden. So therefore, the if, the Ständerat, I look it up, but Ständerat is just the cantons. They say they're usually more conservative, so they said, well, that's good. However, in the Nationalrat, there was Gerhard Anderey. So you might have heard of him. He's really one of the digital politicians nowadays, and he actually convinced the Nationalrat to remove this nasty phrase, because this phrase removed actually says everybody has to open source without any ifs. And then actually the Ständerat, they wanted to stick with it. However, as we'll see in a moment, we could make a compromise. And this is actually the good thing in Swiss politics. I really believe in the system. There was the Ständerat from Canton of Zug, which we are here now, Matthias Michel. He actually asked André Silberschmidt to make a compromise, because he was the colleague of him in the other commission, Ständeratskommission and Nationalratskommission. So I was allowed to actually put this email here. So, dear Andre, please actually respect the will of the government to open source and make it the default, if only, and so the default is open source it only if some third-party rights are infringed, or if there are some security-related reasons. And this sounds now for a non-IT person quite good. So there are some exceptions, but the default is clear. And that's why actually we celebrated this now about a year ago, when this embark finally passed the parliament. And now actually exactly this same phrase is now written and put into action. Yeah. So we could have said, well, that's good. So we can party and then finish our work and stop lobbying. However, in politics, we never can stop, because the law is just some dead letters, and we have to implement it and make it really visible and inform every single IT provider and also the IT people within the government and everybody that this law exists. So otherwise, it's not being implemented. And that's why I'm here. So, so the paradigm change actually is really to implement this into the heads, that since the 1st of January 2024, it's mandatory that every single code which is written by anybody in the Swiss government, or if an IT provider provides software, individual software, then actually this is to be open sourced. Except if it's like the software which belongs to some company, which is this well, this is the federal general principle. So it's, except if there is third-party code, or is there security-related reasons. But, well, what does this mean? What are good reasons for not open sourcing software? Because the most security-related software is open source, obviously. So from my point of view, this should not be necessary to say there is security-related reasons, but well, there will be definitely people who claim that. Now, so this software being developed or being developed by third parties, this actually says the third-party reasons. This is when the government buys some Microsoft or SAP licenses. So if they buy proprietary software, obviously there is no option to open source it because they don't have the code, they don't have the legal basis, but everything else which is owned by the government, that's when they are supposed to open source it. And so the security-related reasons, well, there are some theoretical thoughts that some tax management software includes some limits on over which kind of level of income there will be tests, and so people should not be allowed to know these limits. But as IT people could imagine, well, we can make this as a parameter, put it in some text file and remove it from the code, so it would be even better code quality to not include such limitations or some numbers in the code anyway. But we can discuss this in a minute. So what do you think? Is there security-related code from the government? Are there good reasons or not? Now, one more thing maybe also to mention, and then I'm done. So there is also the option, and that's why this is also part of the law, is that the agency who releases the code is also allowed to provide services. So that, let's say this is the critical part where actually the federal court initially wanted to help the canton of Bern, but then actually this weblaw company said, well, but we are the providers, we provide help. But you know, if dumping open source on GitHub is not open source in real. So you have to have some community building activity, you have to inform people, you have to make documentation and provide some training and so on. So therefore, it's necessary that the agencies are allowed to provide some services more than just dumping the code. And this is also possible. They are allowed to charge other agencies for that, which I think is okay. But they also can be exceptions from charging other agencies. So therefore, it's even better because it actually doesn't make sense, all this kind of charging other agencies. Yeah. So from my point of view, this is actually a very good, we are in a good state at the moment. There's one person which I think is very important in this whole process, this is Bruno. Bruno, he is one of the IT people from the Bundeskanzlei, the DTI, the part which actually manages the strategy of IT in the government. And he actually received some funding for now creating guidelines and actually creating some recommendations to agencies on how to open source, because obviously not everybody knows how to do that. And we know there are some challenges about scanning the code or license compliance and so on. So therefore, there will be some additional documentation. You can actually go to this link. We invited Bruno Schöb, the General Assembly of CH Open this year, so he explained very detailed on what steps are now to happen, and there will be more activity soon. At the moment, we're still trying to push this announcement on every event which is possible. Now, that's it for the moment. I have some questions for you, but I think, that's it. Thanks.
Just a very short one. You translated sicherheitsrelevant with security. Couldn't it also be safety?
Absolutely, yeah. So, okay. Yeah. But the idea is actually that safety would be diminished, which decrease if the agency would open source the software. I really cannot think on any lowering the safety if good open source code is being released. Of course, if it's bad code, then yeah, absolutely. But this is also part of the plan to actually improve software quality, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah, great talk. Very interesting insights in the German law building process. Swiss, sorry. Yeah, because the next thing that I wanted to say is, so in Germany, there is a political will also to do more public open source or open source because of government processes or activities or whatever. Now, how to say this, an organization close to the German government approached me and they asked me, Thomas, you're doing things like this at Siemens, so what do we need to do when we want to open source something? And then I asked them, well, why do you want to open source? What do you want to do?
What's the plan,
do you want to have more people to join forces? Do you want to have other customers? I say, no, we don't. we have the requirement to do open source, period. And they literally did not know what to do. Yeah. And now you mentioned that the current Swiss law would allow support, as far as I understood it, but is there a closer definition about what this is? And are the government agencies forced to do this? Because otherwise they could just publish something on GitHub, no README, no documentation or whatever, then yes, it is open source, but no one could ever use it.
That's exactly a very good point. So obviously there will be examples where the government just dumps the code to fulfill the law. So I think we have to live with it. So we cannot force everybody to understand and really benefit from it. And let's be honest, maybe there is some components which are so strange or so badly programmed that no one else will use it. And so therefore it doesn't make sense to really make huge effort for community building if there's really no demand for this very exotic type of software. But of course now we can actually support everybody who understands or wants to understand open source software development, and there are also resources hopefully being prepared now, and then people will understand, because the private sector does it for many years, open sourcing obviously, Siemens and other companies, and you don't do it because just of the world peace and things like that, but you do it for business purposes. And in the end also the government will understand, it takes a little bit longer usually in the government.
Thanks.
So what does it actually mean for the Swiss railways? Because many of the software development is actually ordered by a government agency, the BFH, Bundesamt für Verkehr.
Yeah, so they actually they have some activities going on. So, you might have open transport data, the open journey planner. There is lots of open source being already ordered by the government and being released. But we have to say Swiss Railway Association, SBB, is not below this MBAG law because they are not within this central body of agencies. There are actually 3 layers, if you make it very simple. So there's a core federal administration, which is all regular Bundesämter, federal agencies. Then there are the peripheral, the dezentrale Bundesverwaltung, which actually includes agencies like the Institute for Intellectual Property, IGE, or Swissmedic, or FINMA, and like the public agencies, but not below this core thing. And then there's this 3rd layer, which is SBB or Post, or really companies. You're a company, obviously, so therefore that's why you're not forced. But last week, Jochen Decker, the CIO of SBB, was on a conference we organized, and really he's really big fan of open source, and he really promotes this because he was liked on LinkedIn a lot with his posts, and so therefore there's also some benefits with open sourcing. So therefore I think I don't worry about SBB, more a little bit about the Post. Is there someone from the Post? So let's talk about open source. Or Swisscom. Well, Swisscom. Anyone from Swisscom? Yeah, but Swisscom also is actually on this list, so they're actually on the OSS benchmark, they're quite good.
I'm ex-Swisscom, but no, I'm not. I have a good example I'd like you to give us your opinion on. So if you look in the last few months, there's two kind of dramas going on at the moment in the open source world and also more in the infrastructure world. So there's this VMware Broadcom story, which is more like getting locked out. And you can pretty much draw a line that everything related to government is running on some sort of VMware implementation. Even if it's like, say, BI-bit, which would be big enough, you know, to challenge it. But if you go to a small Gemeinde or whatever, they're at a loss. And to me, it's a concrete thing where a big vendor buys another pretty big vendor that is running even OT operations, you know, workloads, and now you suddenly get locked out. And we should have made the bet years ago to go with something like OpenStack, you know, something open source. And now, unfortunately, you know, half the telco world runs on, you know, something that's getting, you know, pulled out because they've decided on some business decision that we're only going to focus on huge accounts. And the government isn't big enough as a big account. And then secondly, another one is, if you look at also Terraform, so I'm get you aware of OpenTofu. You know, so like, does this law protect us, or can it like somehow put something in CMAT? CMAT is the bidding platform too, where you get all these calls, you know, that actually questions this, you know, questions the liability that we should have an open source law to, you know, push the button to the vendors. Just on your opinion.
I fully agree. So this is the mission for my next 10 years. So that's absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. So there is lots of vendor lock-in, obviously, with these proprietary vendors, and they actually try to manage these dependencies quite well. But we have to start somewhere. So this open source embark, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution for every problem in the world. It just solves the problem of the government, Swiss federal government, now being mandatory releasing open source software and hopefully building some communities out of it, and hopefully actually spreading this mindset of open source development in the IT sector, which nowadays in Switzerland is really not. There obviously are companies, people like here, which are here, but if you go to regular IT events, you really are kind of looked at. What kind of nerds are these? And so therefore. Well, I have some experience in Germany. I think there's this Zentrum for digitale Souveränität, CENDIS. Digital sovereignty is very common. Opencode.de is very common. So things, Open Desk. So there is really much more going on. In Switzerland, we have now this law, and hopefully we have something to show in a few years that also the people have to understand. In the end, the government people have to understand the benefits. The law is actually forcing them to understand the benefits of open source.
Thanks for a great presentation. I was wondering Klaus about safety software, but this might be more related, or are you certain that this is about IT safety and not maybe about like government safety, like military intelligence, and that these areas are excluded from it, which might make more sense for me at least.
Yeah, so I get your point. So at the moment, this law, it's like this. So if there is security-related reasons, you are allowed not to open source. And of course, the Swiss Army or any other police, FedPol, and so they can argue we are now kind of the mobile app for every police officer is not being allowed to be open source because hackers could introduce. Yeah, so these are reasons which at the moment is possible to use. So yeah. But other than that, no, there's no reason except if they don't own the right of the software, copyright obviously. But I would be really interested in having or hearing cases where it's dangerous to release a software code for security-related reasons. Yeah.
I mean, other than the security-relevant reasons, the third-party rights also seems like quite a big loophole. I would say, like, if I as a company don't want to open source my code, all I have to do is send another company to bid, and then sell them a very restrictive license on my code, and they resell it to the government.
Actually, it's important to note that the default AGBs, the general terms and conditions of the federal government actually says if you are providing software development for the government, the copyright belongs to the government by default. And of course, if they have bad negotiations with the lawyers, they don't use this copyright. But usually, if there is on CMAP or any other platform some software being developed for the government, then the government owns the software. And in this moment, when it owns the software and the software is finished, even if now the software is already before 2024, if it receives a major upgrade, then actually the upgrade has to be open source. So from my point of view, there shouldn't be a loophole. That the one problem could be that the government uses lots of SAP or Microsoft and other proprietary basic things, and they put software on top of these proprietary frameworks and components, and you cannot use, well, they have to open source this code, and so the users have to buy the licenses for SAP in order to use the code. But we cannot solve that.
Question from the chat.
So I'm not sure I understand fully the question, but like there was somebody asking like can code like hacking tools from Secret Service, for instance, apply to this security critical definition, or for instance the Secret Service may have tools that they don't want to release because they may void their possibilities of getting information. So I don't know if this is considered.
Yeah, so Secret Service, as we have this in, I don't know if you have this in Switzerland, but Nationaler Nachrichtendienst, Bund, NDB, they're also part of the core government, so they also are supposed to open source. I think they have a very easy job to say, well, we have security-related reasons not to open source it. So I don't expect software from FedPol and from the, but for example, EID, the electronic ID, which is now being developed from the government, here actually we already issued a political will to really open source the EID thing. So, and identification is quite critical, so therefore they really have to have good reasons not to open source that.
If we have time, I have a last question.
2 minutes,
Yeah. So I have the feeling that, I don't know if this is your experience when fighting with the Bundesrat and so, but like that you have to teach people how the world actually works. Like some people think that like this security through obscurity is, you know, how you should be. They're like, if nobody knows, then there's no issue. I remember a year ago or so, there was a high-profile case in Spain that a guy found out that the judicial system, he could basically download all of the proceedings, and they wanted to prosecute him because of hacking. No, so he warned them, hey, this is happening, and they wanted to prosecute. So is this happening here too?
Absolutely. So we actually have masterclass courses for politicians to teach them about technical things, and if the plan if it works, we do some Python coding lecture in autumn with the Nationalräte if they want to join. So yeah, so this is one of the core mission to really skill up the politicians on digital things, because if they don't understand what source code is, how could they understand what open source is? So they have to understand the basic mechanics which the kids learn today, hopefully at school. So, yeah. But one more thing. So luckily there are now politicians in the government which actually know how software development works. So for example, Gerhard Andre, he used to be my boss at Leap when I worked for Leap, the company, and he really knows what open source and software is. And also, for example, Dominik Blunci from the Nationalrat Mitte, he is software developer at T&M, the company providing lots of software products and services. And the others also, well, Franz Grüter, he owns a data center and so on. So these are really technical people, and also mainly well, she's the wife of Balthasar, and they are also very digital-minded people. So therefore, I think, and these are, it's over the part, it's not one party, these are from all different parties. And so I think we have quite some credibility. If they recommend to do it like that, the other members of the same party, they usually follow and help. As this example showed with, where actually Matthias Michel asked Andri to implement this very important little sentence. So this is kind of the trust mechanism. It's similar like in open source. You trust someone who knows how this kernel thing works, and therefore you also can build on that. So politics is the same.
Thanks a lot for all your work.